Hello, and welcome to the Ben Shapiro Show. Today, we're going to be learning about the USS Liberty incident. First, some background. The USS Liberty was a floating CIA intelligence gathering platform monitoring all transmissions from all sources involved in the 1967 conflict known as the Six-Day War. Israeli progress was followed, as well as the Arab coalition of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, known as the United Arab Republic. However, Israeli intelligence had reported to Chief of Israeli Naval Operations, Admiral Isi Rihar, that a ship had fired upon El Arish in Sinai. This was proven to be a ruse. The only ship in that area was the USS Liberty, which flew the U.S. flag and was in international waters. In what was described by both President Lyndon B. Johnson and the Israeli government as a case of mistaken identity, Israeli air and naval assets attacked the USS Liberty on June 28th. Killing 34 Americans and wounding 172 of the 294-man crew. Also notified of the supposed attack upon El Arish were Colonel Shmuel Kislev, head of Israeli Air Force operations, and General Yeshayahu Benkit, the head of Israeli Air Force intelligence. Kislev told his pilots that, quote, if they could confirm that it was a military ship, they could hit it, end quote. The naval contingent was also on the alert. Benkit wanted to have positive identification of the ship that may have been involved. Israeli fighters passed by and gave their report. The flight leader confirmed that it was an American ship. More Israeli fighters attacked at 14.05 hours for 20 minutes, firing cannons, machine guns, and rockets. And one report from the first pilot who hit the ship stated that oil was leaking. During that time, on board the Liberty, radio operators Terry Halberdier and Glenn Oliphant followed the captain's order and broadcast in the clear that they were under attack by unknown forces and needed assistance. But their communication systems were then damaged by the Israeli bombardment. These brave sailors repaired their antenna by hand under a hail of machine gun fire and began broadcasting without any encryption, as the Israeli forces were specifically blocking American frequencies. The Sixth Fleet received the distress call and informed the commander of the carrier task force on board the USS Saratoga, Captain Joseph Talley, who called and launched 12 Phantom F-4 fighters to assist the stricken USS Liberty. The Sixth Fleet received the distress call and informed the commander of the carrier task force on board the USS Saratoga, Captain Joseph Talley, who called and launched 12 Phantom F-4 fighters to assist the stricken USS Liberty. As the Phantoms were en route just minutes away from saving the Liberty, it was reported that Secretary of Defense Robert Strange McNamara mysteriously had them recalled. The only way a Secretary of Defense could do that was by presidential authority. President Johnson knew the truth about the attack, and he was part of the problem. The next wave of Israeli aircraft arrived after the Phantoms returned to Saratoga, and these were Dassault Super Mystere bombers, armed with napalm and cluster bombs. One pilot called out the ship's identification as Charlie Tango Romeo 5 and stated that, quote, there is no flag on her, unquote. This was a strange report, as the previous reconnaissance flight clearly stated that there was an American flag flying high, and the ship was identified as such. It is believed that this call was made as a ruse to cover the Israelis should these attacks be recorded by third parties. When that transmission was made, Colonel Kislev ordered all aircraft to stop the attack as he believed that the ship was in fact American from the call sign. However, the Israeli commander of the torpedo boat squadron, Moshe Oren, stated that he was not informed that there was a recall from an attack and was informed, in fact, that it was the Egyptian freighter, the Al-Qasir. Therefore, he launched 3 motor torpedo boats. The order to halt all attacks, which followed the second wave of fighters, was supposedly not received by the naval assets, whose 3 torpedo boats launched 6 torpedoes at the USS Liberty, with 5 failing to hit target. But the one that did contact killed 25 men and wounded many more. The Israeli argument of misidentification fails for several reasons. First, if the Israelis had been under the impression that the USS Liberty was an Egyptian ship, why did they specifically jam the secure American radio frequencies, which were in fact narrow bands? Another problem was the identification issue, in that the Liberty, at 10,150 tons, was 5 times larger than the ship they claimed to have mistaken it for. Both ships had totally different profiles, appearances, and of course, flags. In addition, if the attack was a simple error, why were the Israeli jets unmarked, bearing no Israeli symbols, carrying no national identification in violation of international law? Had the F-4 Phantom jets from the Saratoga not been recalled, the torpedo boats would not have been able to engage, and the majority of the men would not have been killed and wounded. The official American position was that Israel called and said that they had recognized their mistake and that the attack was over. So therefore, in response, McNamara recalled the jets. However, the attacks were then renewed for another 80 minutes. This was a strange development since the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv reported that the Israelis had attacked the ship, but the nationality of the ship was yet undetermined by Israel. If this was true, how would McNamara know to recall the Phantoms and that it was in fact the Liberty? The distress call was sent a second time after the damaged radio system was repaired, and it was picked up this time by the aircraft carrier USS America, and 2 ships were rushed to the scene. 3 life rafts were lowered into the water so that sailors could get off the burning ship, but the Israeli torpedo boats focused their fire on these, destroying 2 of the life rafts and sweeping the decks with autocannon fire to kill as many men as they could to prevent an evacuation. That act alone is a violation of the Geneva Convention, not to mention attacking a ship from a non-belligerent neutral nation in international waters. Another strange development took place when the USS Liberty and its crew sailed to Malta after the attack. The Sixth Fleet commander, Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, ordered the survivors to remove the ship's name from their uniforms. In fact, Admiral Kidd even ordered them to go ashore in civilian clothes, which the men were not supposed to have on board anyway. They were also told to grant no interviews and not to discuss the events of that day, even among each other. Otherwise, they would face court-martial and prison, or even worse, for violating national security. Both the Israelis and the Americans involved had their opinions on what happened and why. One voice was that of Navy Captain Dr. Richard Kiefer, who was wounded badly himself but worked for 28 hours straight, saving lives when he could. He received the Silver Star. Captain William McConnell received the Medal of Honor for his efforts following the 13 repetitious attacks. After his bridge crew were killed, himself badly wounded, his recollection was that the aircraft hit the ship from every direction in multiple waves. Since the attack involved the Israeli Air Force and Navy, that made it a combined arms attack, meaning that it was coordinated, which also meant the command authority came from the seat of government. The Israeli military did not simply attack an unknown ship in international waters, let alone an American ship without orders. All the crew believed that the ship was clearly identified as American, as there were reconnaissance aircraft that passed by close enough for the crew to look into the cockpits. Several high-ranking American military and political persons knew at that time that the attack was deliberate. The question was why. The cover-up was incredible. For example, the press was given limited information to downplay the event. The men were sworn to secrecy, and the Judge Advocate General of the Navy, Admiral Merlin Starling, was given only 24 hours to review the 600-page Court of Inquiry investigation report. He had great reservations about the veracity of the report. In fact, the Navy inquiry did not allow any testimony or evidence regarding the unmarked Israeli aircraft. No information was included about the life rafts that were shot up or the electronics transmission jamming, or even McNamara's recall of the American fighters. This was the first and only time in U.S. history that a board of inquiry refused to accept testimony from American service members who survived an attack and only accepted the statements of the forces that had attacked them. Bill May, a crewman, was given the name tag Smith, removed from a hospital ward with a dozen other patients and placed into a single room. A naval officer soon entered and told him that his name was now Smith, that he was never on the Liberty, and that he was never to discuss the matter. In another completely absurd and totally insane turn of events, the Senate transcripts, as well as the Medal of Honor Society, recorded that Captain McGonigal's Medal of Honor was earned in Vietnam, not off the Sinai Peninsula. His Medal of Honor citation mentions no specific geographic location and does not mention who the enemy was. The ship's log was also altered to fit the Israeli timeline, supporting that only after 20 minutes of engagement, the ship was attacked for a total of 50 minutes and not 2 hours, with the Israeli fighters, bombers, and torpedo boats breaking off contact after they realized their error. This was obviously not true, but why the cover-up? Why the attack? The CIA transcripts were handed to the American ambassador in Lebanon at that time. The transcripts clearly show that the pilots, upon reaching Liberty, reported that it was an American ship. Their war room ordered them to attack. Again, the flight commander repeated his warning that the ship was American. Again, he was told, "You have your orders." And the attack started. What came to light later was the justification for sinking the Liberty and killing the crew. Moshe Dayan, the commander-in-chief of Israeli forces, had ordered the attack. This was due to the fact that Israeli commanders in the field were authorized to execute Egyptian prisoners of war rather than lose time transporting and securing them. There were many incidents in the 1967 war in which Egyptian soldiers were killed by Israeli troops after they had raised their hands in surrender. Declassified Israeli Defense Force documents show that on June 11, 1967, the operations branch of the General Staff felt it necessary to issue new orders concerning the treatment of prisoners. The order read that because existing orders were contradictory, soldiers and civilians who surrendered were not to be hurt by any means. Secondly, soldiers and civilians who possessed weapons and failed to surrender would be killed. However, Israeli soldiers caught disobeying the order by killing prisoners were to be severely punished. This appears to be damage control and could only have been issued by the top brass of the Israeli military. These orders were issued due to the Israeli knowledge that they did not destroy the Liberty and that intercepted transmissions could prove these criminal actions. This appears to be a classic case of covering their collective rear ends. If this information were to have gotten out, it would prove that Israel was committing war crimes. Israel's legitimacy was already in question since they launched the preemptive strike on Arab airfields. It does not take a great stretch of logic to understand why the cover-up took place and from where it originated. The United States could not afford to have its great ally, Israel, accused of war crimes. There are contradictory reports available where U.S. officials claim to have debunked the murders of Egyptian prisoners of war as the reason for the attack, supporting the Israeli attack as a case of mistaken identity. That is also part of the cover-up. Years later, murdered Egyptian soldiers were found in shallow graves. Several prominent Americans, generals, admirals, and even Medal of Honor recipients, as well as the surviving crew, have demanded a full congressional investigation into the attack and cover-up for decades. Regardless of these demands, the United States government has continually refused to allow an independent investigation. Guess what, Goyim? That investigation will never happen.